So I'm going to be presenting. Maybe pitched at a different level than people here are used to. And yeah, this is some joint work with Shaun Nichols, who's at Cornell. He's done like really incredible work in moral psychology. Most of what's good in what follows is, I think, due to him. So I really wanted to kind of make this talk a little bit more HPS oriented than my stuff might usually be. So I figured I'd start with some really off the cuff philosophy of biology. So I want to know, like, here's a question you might be interested in. Why does perception cause belief? So it's possible to imagine a more circumspect perceptual system than the one that we actually have, one that takes in images and then reasons about whether to form the belief or not. But look, by making the transition from percept to belief automatic, the perceptual system gains in speed. And this is an advantage only in a world where perception is generally accurate. You might get something similar with the relationship between environments and motivation as well. So what happens when a vervet monkey hears the raptor call on Pacific? Well, they look up. Why do they do that? Well, there's a really circumspect explanation. The monkey thinks something like, that is the raptor call. I don't want to be eaten by a raptor, so I should look up and see if there really is a raptor. I think, like, I might be the person in this room most inclined to think that something like that could be going on in the mind of a monkey, and even I think that's probably not what's happening, right? It's more likely that what's going on is automatic, right? The raptor call bypasses rational deliberation and generates the motivation to look up. And this is what we should expect given the importance of not getting eaten. And these considerations about how perception drives the formation of beliefs and how certain interactions with our environment might drive the formation of motivations are just instances of these more general speed accuracy trade-off considerations, right? So if the speed of a response to some stimulus is critical and false positives aren't too costly, so if it's not very costly for the vervet monkey to look up, then maybe we should expect a mechanism to favor allowing false positives in the interest of having a processing mechanism that is simpler and hence faster, right? So the simpler processing mechanism is the one that just triggers the motivation to look up when the monkey hears the vervet call. And this is all to set up the view that I want to discuss and defend today, which is what Shaun and I are calling the Spinozan theory of motivation, for reasons that will sort of become clear later on. And this is the view that it is possible to activate motivations with utterances of imperative sentences directly. That is, without updating on information that gets mediated through belief, desire, reasoning. So when someone tells you to do something, you are motivated to do it directly. And these motivations, obviously, you don't always do what people tell you, I hope. So often these motivations are going to be suppressed. for instance, in cases where they conflict with your other more important motivations and goals or beliefs. And I'll get into more detail about that later. So I think that, and we think that these speed accuracy considerations favor the Spinozan theory of motivation. And I'll explain why. So here's the plan. So by way of some setup, I'll say some stuff about how linguistic signals might get interpreted into beliefs and motivations and other attitudes. And also just more generally, what it is I'm talking about when I say imperative. Like, so what's the scope of this question? When we're saying it's possible to activate motivations with utterances and imperatives, what sorts of utterances specifically are we interested in? Then I will basically give a gloss of some alternatives to the view that we're interested in and say why we think they go wrong. And then finally, I'll say some stuff about what exactly might be driving the formation of motivations upon the interpretation of imperative utterance. Okay. So what is an imperative? Well, it's one of three imperative sentences, or one of the three types of sentences that seem to be universal across all human languages. So in every language, you have some, formal distinction between declarative sentences, which are used to make assertions, to convey information, interrogative sentences, which are used to ask questions, and imperative sentences, which are used to change the future course of events by way of, giving your addressee some behavior decision. So, you're nice to your grandmother conveys the information to you that you're nice to your grandmother. Are you nice to your grandmother is another, is a sentence you can use that relates you to that information, but in a different way. If you're trying to request the information. And be nice to your grandmother is yet another way of relating to that information, namely by trying to make it true. So what's so interesting about these different types of sentences is that we use them to do different sorts of things, right? Typically. Imperatives are used to do a lot of different sorts of things. You might think that commanding or ordering is sort of like the canonical use of an imperative. So like when a drill instructor says to their cadets, drop and give me 20. But we also use imperatives to make requests, like pass the salt, to give like helpful instructions, permissions, like have an almond. What all of these different sorts of speech acts have in common is that they're attempts at changing or constraining the behavior of one's addressee. But it's worth pointing out that you can perform a lot of these actions with other sentence types as well. So orders, requests, and instructions can all be performed with declarative and interrogative sentences. So I could say drop and give me 20, or I could say I order you to do 20 push-ups. I could say pass the salt, or I could say, can you please pass the salt? I could tell you how to get to Harlem, or I could tell you how to get to Harlem with a modalized sentence, like you ought to take the A train, or you should take the A train. We are going to sort of, I mean, these are really interesting complications, but what I'm going to focus on are what are sometimes called clause types, which are pairs of sentence types and their sort of like canonical discourse function, right? So what I'm really interested in, or what I'm really going to be focusing on, are imperative clauses, or imperative clause types, right? So imperatives that are used to direct the future course of events. There might be other uses of imperatives, and there are certainly uses of declarative and interrogative sentences that pattern with the canonical use of an imperative, but we're just going to ignore all that. So what I'm talking about today is when you use an imperative in the normal way, when you use an imperative to direct, how do you give someone a motivation? And it's certainly true that you can. Okay. So the first thing we might want to ask is like, just what goes on when you're like interpreting a sentence? What do you get from a sentence? Unsurprisingly, I don't think we know a whole lot, but how exactly this works. But there's been a lot of focus on the processing and interpretation of declarative sentences. So what do you get from an assertion of a declarative sentence? Well, the core meaning expressed by a declarative sentence is the truth condition of content or proposition, right? So when I tell you you're nice to your grandmother, what you get is a propositional thought content, the content that you're nice to your grandmother. And, interpreting the sentence might involve the construction of like a really rich mental model. Maybe there's mental imagery involved. There's been this really like productive research program concerned with what exactly people construct on the basis of sentences they hear. So if I tell you, I'm baking bread tomorrow, and if I tell you I'm baking bread tomorrow, but not cookies, there's some evidence that the mental model you construct on the basis of those two distinct utterances is really similar. You don't involve the like negated cookie baking in your mental model. And evidence for this comes from the fact that it's often a lot harder to recall the negated content. But all this is just to say that what you get from the assertions of declarative sentences is some kind of informational thought content. Like how that is how you represent that to yourself is another question. On a really traditional view of meaning, that's what you get from any kind of sentence. The meaning for a complete sentence is just the truth conditions associated with it. So you are nice to your grandmother expresses the proposition that you are nice to your grandmother. And be nice to your grandmother also expresses the proposition that you are nice to your grandmother. And what these different sentence form types encode is different ways for our actions, our speech actions, to relate to that same information. So expressing it, bringing it about, inquiring after it. One way of understanding this is in terms of the really familiar philosophical notion of direction of fit. So assertions have, I'm pretty sure this, everyone always like messes this up. Word to world or mind to world direction of fit, and imperatives, world to word direction of fit. So the idea is you have the same propositional content, different ways of relating to it. So this is all just to say, when someone asserts a declarative sentence to you, there's something you get from that assertion, namely some propositional content, and that might be what you get from a command performed with an imperative as well, although that has become more and more practical. How does that information that you get from the assertion of a declarative sentence make its way into your set of beliefs, right? When I tell you, it's going to be sunny all day tomorrow, I'm not just giving you something to think about. I seem to be trying to change your mind in a more substantial way by giving you a belief. Well, on the Cartesian theory of belief formation, and what might be thought of as like a kind of standard kind of belief formation, interpreting the sentence produces a thought that is entertained but not believed. And then belief formation is an effortful, epistemically demanding process, right? So if I tell you it's raining right now, you get a thought, you entertain the thought that it's raining right now, but then whether that thought makes its way into your, belief box, so to speak, is this like separate question, right? I mean, you might just look outside and see that what I'm saying is false. If you don't have access to a window, you might sort of, weigh my apparent sincerity against my history of being wrong about the weather, et cetera, et cetera. But on the sort of standard view, what you get from an utterance of a declarative sentence or an assertion made using a declarative sentence is a thought that you entertain and that you may or may not come to believe. So on the Cartesian model, the uptake of a declarative utterance is a non-committal thought. But on an alternative model of how beliefs are formed on the basis of assertions of declarative sentences, the uptake of the declarative utterance just is a belief. And this is what's been called the Spinozan theory of belief formation. And this comes most recently from the work of people like Gilbert and Mandelbaum. And the idea, narrowly located here in the sort of linguistic context, is that on hearing a declarative utterance, you interpret that utterance, and the output of that interpretation is a proposition that is automatically stored as a belief. So when I tell you it's raining right now, you just automatically believe me. And beliefs like the obviously false one I would have just given you have to be eliminated or fragmented, that is stored elsewhere in the mind, to maintain cognitive coherence. So on the Spinozan theory of belief formation, belief acquisition is the effortless automatic process, and belief rejection is effortful. And the evidence for this sort of view that people often point to is that under high cognitive load, people have a tendency to recall as true sentences, things that they were told that they otherwise would never have believed, right? So the idea is I might say a lot of stuff to you that you are very unlikely to believe. If you are under a lot of cognitive load, you are more likely to believe those things. And that's supposed to be evidence for the claim that, you're storing these things as beliefs automatically, And when you're under too much cognitive load, it's harder for you to reject them. So the Spinozan theory of belief formation is basically the inspiration for the Spinozan theory of imperative motivation. So if the uptake of a declarative utterance is a belief, well, then the uptake of an imperatival utterance is motivation. And it's just worth noting here that though these views are obviously related in some way, they are logically independent, right? They don't stand and fall together. You might, in fact, be very, I don't know, allergic to cognitive notions like belief, for instance. You might be someone who thinks that the question of how we form beliefs on the basis of utterances of declarative sentences is just like there's something wrong about that question. But you could still think the question of how we get motivations from imperatives is an interesting question. So you could think, well, belief, we shouldn't be talking about that. Haven't we learned anything from, like, I don't know, the last half century of philosophy of cognitive science? But motivation, well, that has to be real. I myself am not inclined to think this way. I am a big fan of the Spinozan theory of belief. But this is all just to say, you could agree with me and Shaun without taking on board this whole big controversial picture. But I think we're pretty sympathetic to the whole package. Okay, so again, in slightly more detail, the Spinozan theory of motivation from imperatives just says that on hearing an imperative utterance by your interpretive system, decodes that utterance, and the output of the decoding process is a motivation to buy. And these motivations might be suppressed or eliminated to maintain coherence, for instance, with your other motivations, with your beliefs, etc. And just to kind of tie things back to the very beginning of the talk, so why might these speed accuracy considerations favor the Spinozan theory? Well, you could focus on two very different sorts of cases. If I'm in an environment where people are constantly issuing imperatives at me that are contrary to my interests, it would not be in my best interest to ever do what they say, or to things would not go better for me if I had a mechanism that caused me to sort of be automatically motivated by what I was being told to do. On the other hand, if I'm in an environment where it's almost always in my best interest to be motivated to conform to imperatives directed at me, then for roughly the same reasons that it seems to be in my best interest to form beliefs automatically on the basis of my perceptions, or perceptual information, or the very same reason that it's in the vervet monkey's best interest to look up automatically when it hears the raptor call, it might be in my best interest to form the motivation to do what I'm told automatically, with the option of suppressing that motivation later on, if I should come to realize that it's not in my best interest. But that's a very sort of speculative, loosey-goosey kind of motivation for taking on our favored view. What I'm going to do now is go over some plausible alternative accounts of how imperatives give rise to motivation, and try to demonstrate that these views are just fail to explain all the cases in which we get motivated by imperatives. And what you should be, left to conclude is that R is right. So probably the most, but I'd be very happy in the Q&A to hear if anyone has any other suggestions. And so honestly, another thing I'll say right here, is that this question of how we get motivations from imperatives is not so widely discussed. So if all that you get out of this talk is some sense of the different things you might say in response to the question, how do imperatives motivate? I'd be very happy with that. Just trying to create some territory to be mapped, so to speak, is, I think, for me, one of the biggest motivations here. So the most plausible, or I think for philosophers at least, what will probably seem like the most plausible account of how we get motivations, how we get motivated by imperatives, is what I'll call inferentialism. And the inferentialist picture is something like the following. On hearing an imperative utterance, you acquire some information. For example, that the speaker wants you to do the thing you were told to do, or that they recommend doing it. This information gets combined with background states of mind, B. So for instance, your background knowledge, your other motivations, your preferences, whatever you think plays a role in rational decision making. And depending on what exactly is in B, the integration of B and I might generate the motivation to do what you were told. And it's pretty clear that we reason in this way sometimes, on the basis of linguistic interactions with other people. So, if we're at a barbecue place in St. Louis, and I can't decide if I want the ribs or the chicken wings, and you tell me, well, they're out of chicken wings, what am I going to do? I'll probably order the ribs. And it seems like something roughly this process is explaining my behavior, right? I acquired some info. I had a set of background states. I was motivated to get something good at this barbecue place. I had strong motivation to get chicken wings. I had strong motivation to get ribs. I had knowledge about how to do both of these things. I was trying to decide which to do. You gave me some new information. That new information combined with my background states, and I made the decision I did. Of course, there's tons of work in behavioral economics suggesting that, sometimes when you get information like that, maybe I would just go and order some apple pie instead, and that's supposed to be evidence that we're not very rational. Setting that sort of thing aside, it seems pretty clear that we reason in this way sometimes, right? Or at least we take ourselves to reason in this way. But in the case I just, ran through, the information I got came in the form of a assertion made with a declarative sentence. What kind of information do you get from an utterance like "get the ribs" or "buy me a coffee"? Well, lots of people have made lots of different really compelling proposals about what sorts of things you learn from an imperative. So David Lewis famously thought that imperative sentences encoded this kind of speech act content. So if I tell you "buy me a coffee," I'm giving you the information. I instruct you to buy me a coffee. Kaufman, in her fantastic book, Interpreting Imperatives, argues that imperatives express modal claims, like you ought to buy me a coffee. Cleo Kondrabi and Sven Lauer. This is kind of like not fair to them, really, because their view's a lot more sophisticated than this. So they think that imperatives express what they call a rational preference, something like a desire that the addressee buy them a coffee. And in my dissertation, I argued that imperatives encode information about the addressee's decision-making situation. Any one of these things, if the story, if what you're interested in is like why it's ever rational to do what someone tells you, then you are going to need to answer this question of like, what kind of information you get from an imperative. I mean, maybe you think, we shouldn't be trying to tell that sort of story at all. But if what you're interested in is how imperatives play some role in like rational deliberation and rational decision making, and you're like a good, traditional Bayesian, there has to be some informational content being conveyed by the imperative. And obviously I have like a course in this race, but I think, and these are all like, well, the first three of these are very important, good suggestions. And the fourth one is true. But that's if you're interested in answering this question of like how rationally we can come to be motivated on the basis of an imperative utterance, just how things actually go. Well, it's plausible that this is how things sometimes actually go. So if a toddler says, gimme, Shaun wrote this part, pointing out what's in your hand, you're not just going to hand the toddler whatever you're holding, right? You infer that the toddler wants you to give him the object in your hand. So it's I star. If the object is a knife, your background states B star plus I star, the integration of that state and this information is not going to generate the motivation to hand it over, right? If you're holding a knife and a toddler tells you to give him the knife, you won't do that. And presumably, you'd be able to report on the reasons you didn't do it, right? But if the object's a mug, if your background beliefs include, that the mug is robust, it's not toxic, it's empty, then those background states, B double star, might integrate with I star in a way that generates the motivation to get it over. So there are these sorts of cases of imperative inference that appear to correspond to the inferentialist picture, right? Another thing we might think is driving imperative motivation is just some kind of reinforcement learning. And here the story is a lot simpler. On hearing an imperative utterance, phi, if there's been a history of reinforcement for phi-ing after hearing phi, then there's going to be motivation to phi. Right. And this also, there are some plausible real-world cases of reinforcement, or some plausible cases of imperative motivation, some cases of imperative motivation that are plausibly explained as a kind of reinforcement learning. So, a child is frequently heard her father yell stop. When the child is frozen following stop, she was praised. But when the child continued in her activity following stop, she has been injured or scolded. And through reinforcement learning, the child might come to develop a habit of stopping when hearing stop. So that's a sort of case that you might think, a reinforcement learning story might make sense there. Often we are able to get our pets to miraculously learn a little bit of English, right? They respond to our imperatives. Of course, what's happening is probably reinforcement learning, and certainly. But the reinforcement learning story is really limited. It's only going to work for the items that were under reinforcement, but not for any novel cases, right? So it requires that a particular trigger type gets associated with a particular behavioral disposition. And it's unlikely that you'd be trained on the following inputs, but we predict you'd have a similarly fast reaction. Of course, this is a, as of yet, untested prediction, the first of many. Pass the sage, drop and give me 22, look at the fridge, goulash, yelled in a very specific context, namely you're like cooking with someone else and you want them to pass you the goulash. So if the reinforcement learning story is true at all, it can only be true in conjunction with a story that explains some other story that explains these other sorts of cases. So maybe something like an inferentialist picture plus a reinforcement learning story is enough to explain the whole range of cases in which we respond to imperative utterances by being motivated to do what we're told. But I think that there are some reasons to think that the inferentialist story is also too limited, and there are cases that just don't seem to be covered by inferentialism or a reinforcement learning story. So where you just genuinely seem to form the motivation automatically. So I'll discuss a couple of cases. The one case we're calling Simon Says. So, and hopefully these will all be pretty easy to remember. So a group of children are playing Simon Says. So just to, does everyone know what Simon Says is? Oh, okay. So Simon Says is a game where the way it's played is I'll say something like, Simon says, touch your nose, and you have to do whatever Simon says. But if I tell you to do something without first saying Simon says, and you do it, you lose, right? So Simon says, touch your nose, you touch your nose, good. Simon says, touch your hip, you touch your hip, good. Touch your head, if you touch your head, you lose. So that's the game. A group of children are playing Simon Says. When the game leader says, touch your nose, a few children comply, even though she didn't say Simon Says. It's one case. Familiar childhood tragedy. Another case, wave. At a baseball game, someone points a camera at you and says, wave. You wave at the camera. Why did I do that? You think to yourself afterwards. Finally, kitchen. Bryce and Hannah have opened a restaurant. In the kitchen, they shout orders at one another with the expectation that the other responds swiftly and unthinkingly. Spatula, salt, soup. Anyone who's ever worked in a kitchen knows that this is. Okay, so why can't inferentialism explain these cases? We have a few things to say to cast out on the inferentialist picture. So one is that, look, if inferentialism is right, you should be able to provide the information that you get from an imperative as an assertion and still get the same motivational result that you do with the imperative. So there has to be, if the inferentialist picture is right, there has to be some kind of informational paraphrase for every utterance of an imperative. Not only that, the informational paraphrase has to have the same effect as the imperative does, right? So telling someone just wave, there has to be something you could have said, something you could have conveyed with a declarative that got you the same result. Like, I want you to wave, I command you to wave, I recommend that you wave, you ought to wave. And again, here's like untested empirical claim number 2. We predict that So it says 13 and 14, but it should really say 5 and 6. We predict that 5 is going to be more automatically motivating than anything you could come up with in 6. So that's one issue, is like the inferentialist is committed to some kind of informational paraphrase, but we just don't think that there are informational paraphrases for these imperatives out there that are going to be automatically motivating in the right way. That's one. The other is look, it's just really plausible that sometimes we act on imperatives without making an inference first. So there's clearly no conscious inference from the proposition that Beth said, touch your toes, or, you know, some information expressed by Beth saying, touch your toes, and some desire to do what Beth says to a decision to touch your toes. You know, one reason we know that there's no conscious inference in this case is that, well, if you're playing the game, you didn't have any, you know, background desire to just do whatever Beth says, right? What about non-conscious inference? You know, intuitively, I mean, I'm kind of going out on a bit of a limb here, but I'm a very traditional analytic philosopher, so I can do that. Bound to the limits of intuitively, horrible word. The reactions in these cases just seem way too fast to be inferences. But of course, this might just be putting arbitrary constraints on non-conscious inference, which we don't want to do. Maybe a little bit more damning. You know, inference is often taken to be rational, even within psychology, even when it's non-conscious. Yet in a lot of the cases where individuals appear to go from an imperative to a motivation, it doesn't seem like there is any rational reconstruction you can do. They're not being very rational. The Simon Says case is a good instance of this. The Wave case might be as well. Can this be empirically established? So it might be possible to experimentally establish that reactions in these cases are not based on any kind of inference. Here's how we think you might be able to do this. So subjects could be tested under varying degrees of cognitive load on the reaction times to the kinds of informational inputs that are taken to be candidates for the information you learn from an imperative, as well as on the reaction times to imperative inputs. And our prediction is that they'll respond more quickly to the imperatives and to the informational inputs. Of course, this depends on, you know, solving this problem, right? Really settling on what it is you think people learn from imperative utterances, and also where you think this information is coming from, right? Whether you think it's semantically encoded or inferred from a richer pragmatic context. Finally, there's just a simplicity consideration. So in a word learning study, 16-month-old babies are shown two objects, a ball and a cup, and told, look at the cup. And the babies reliably follow this instruction. Inferentialism requires the infant to think about what the experimenter wants or said, or, you know, whatever, and desire to do what the experimenter wants. And we don't think that this is impossible. And certainly there's plenty of evidence that infants have the ability to attribute goals to individuals. But our Spinozan theory provides a much simpler and more direct account, namely that the imperative utterance just generates some kind of motivation or imperatival mental state. Okay. How exactly do we think this happens? I'm just going to quickly and again, pretty broadly gloss two possible mechanisms. And depending on, I guess, how you're philosophically inclined, you might find one of these a lot more plausible than the other. I think Shaun and I are sort of in disagreement about which one we think is correct. So one is a kind of like cognitivist picture, which is that imperative inference is in fact some learning event. There is some belief acquisition going on, and motivation comes from dissonance reduction. And the other is that the imperative inference triggers the formation of an imperative mental state. So here's how things might go on the dissonance reduction model. When someone tells you to do something, what you learn is some first personal thought content, roughly of the form, I'm fying or I will fy. Okay. So from an imperative like pass the salt, you learn the proposition, I am passing the salt. This belief is obviously going to come into conflict with your other beliefs, given that you're not in fact passing the salt. Such conflict is painful. We seek to reduce this pain by making our beliefs consistent. And this is drawing on work in the literature on dissonance reduction. And one way you might do that is by eliminating the new belief. So if I form a new belief that's inconsistent with my other beliefs, I might just get rid of the new belief. Or I might act in a way that makes all my beliefs coherent. So if I learn that I'm passing you the salt, that's the new belief I get, and that contradicts all my other beliefs. Well, I might just change those other beliefs by passing you the salt. That might be the easiest way out. One reason to go this way is you get this nice, like, unified sort of picture of how we get new attitudes from linguistic signals. So the same exact, and this is just bringing things back to the Spinozan theory of belief formation, exactly what's going on in that case is going on in this case too. Someone tells you something, they tell you P, you form the belief that P, and then P is either integrated into your other beliefs or rejected if it creates dissonance. Likewise, someone tells you to do something, you get this like wonky first personal belief that you're doing it. And that belief is either integrated, by doing the thing or by forming the intention to do the thing, or rejected. You just get one nice, neat story. You get to be a cognitivist, right? And also this is just kind of like, there's something nice and neat about this picture, I think. This is the view that I like. Cons, many. First, there needs to be some way of connecting the imperative form to these, first personal thought contents. And, that is just not something I've specified at all. There might be a weaker version of a view like this where what you learn is, that someone wants you to fy or told you to fy. And this sort of belief causes you to be motivated because, we, of the, pro-social nature of our most fundamental beliefs about ourselves. So like learning that you want me to do something might conflict with my beliefs about myself, right? That I'm helpful, good, and that might just generate the right conflict to be motivated. But that runs into trouble too, because as we were planning earlier, we think that the imperative signal and a signal of the form, I want you to do this for me, are not going to be motivating in precisely the same way. Alternatively, you could think that what you get from an imperative input is just an imperative content. One way of understanding imperative mental states is that, I don't really like talking this way, but, that there are imperatives in our language of thought that serve as the objects of intentions and perhaps other pro-attitudes. So just as an indicative sentence gets interpreted as an indicative thought content, an imperative sentence gets interpreted as a kind of intentional content that directs rather than describes. to quote my colleagues Luca Barlosina and Max Hayward. Prose, I think it's possible to like hold a view like this without taking on too many commitments about like conventionality or the metaphysics of mind. You know, you could be to talk about an imperative thought mental state might just be to give a really sort of like talk in really sort of like general functionalist terms. The cons, well, you know, this involves positing a sui generis thought content. So it requires positing a novel, dedicated structure that takes the linguistic input and directly generates motivation. Also, imperatival mental contents in the literature are typically explained by appeal to imperatival linguistic contents, which is not altogether helpful for us. So, basically right on time. That's sort of all I had to say. Like I said, this was kind of just a big, messy overview of some stuff I've been working on recently, and yeah, I'm looking forward to hear what people think.
Take a 2-minute break, then we'll have half an hour.